So today I kind of wanted to spend the time reflecting on an event that took place in East Harlem during Holy Week, and kind of try to connect it to my call and my reason for coming to seminary, because it just so happened that the three lectures we did on three individuals whose lives had influence in East Harlem were three of my kind of theological heroes, and those who kind of guided me towards my decision to come to Union, which was not something I ever planned, and ever thought I would ever do. So the title, Upside Down in East Harlem, there were three lectures that took place April 10th, 11th, and 12th. The first one was on Oscar Romero. Does everyone ever here know who Oscar Romero was? No, I'll get into that then. Okay. Second one was on Letty Russell. Does anyone know who Letty Russell is? Yes. And the third was on an individual named William Stringfellow. Does anyone know who Stringfellow was? Okay, good. So anyway, the thread, so I'll go, Oscar Romero was a Jesuit priest from El Salvador who was martyred by the government officials in El Salvador for preaching kind of the good news of the poor, for standing on the side of the poor in El Salvador as they fought against the oppression of the government. Letty Russell was one of the first women ordained in the Presbyterian Church. She worked for about 12 years in East Harlem at Church of the Ascension on 116th Street. I think it's either 6th or 16th. I get that confused. Anyway, and William Stringfellow was a Harvard-educated lawyer who made the decision to come and spend time in East Harlem working in the neighborhood, opening a law practice, and living with the people of East Harlem. So the question is, why Upside Down? Why was the title of this lecture series called Upside Down in East Harlem? And I say, there were two reasons. One was because all of these individuals kind of preached an upside down gospel. The last will be the first will be the last. They preached along the lines of the gospel being kind of unequivocally on the side of the poor and the oppressed in society. That was one reason why upside down, an inversion of the values that society tends to place on lives of people who live. The second reason was their lives' stories, in my mind, kind of reflected a flip in values. What's interesting is all three individuals, Letty Russell attended some of the most elite schools in the country. She was on a path to be a wildly successful academic. She was breaking down barriers, becoming the first woman to receive a Bachelor of Divinity at Harvard. She had got her doctorate from Union, yet she chose to reside in East Harlem. She made the decision to live there. William Stringfellow, Harvard-educated lawyer, made the decision to move to East Harlem. And Oscar Romero, before he started his ministry with the poor, was a very conservative theologian. And the reason why he was elected archbishop was largely because he posed no threat to the government. And that was one of the reasons why So the question I have is, what did these three individuals see? What is it that guided them to change their life path and to move into East Harlem, or, for the example of Romero, to take the side of the poor in El Salvador, which really meant risking his own life, and he knew that. And so I start with a quote from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who everyone knows. Does everyone know who Dietrich Bonhoeffer was? Okay, anyway. But what's interesting is Dietrich Bonhoeffer could be included in this story. He came to Union for a year, and he hated it. He said, there's no theology here. And he said this, but on Sundays, he would escape to Harlem. And he spent time at Abyssinian Church in Harlem. And under the guidance of Adam Clayton Powell Sr., he befriended Adam Clayton Powell Jr., and Adam Clayton Powell Jr. brought him in to teach Sunday school in Abyssinian. And there's a fascinating book, if anyone's interested. It's called Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus. And it's about Bonhoeffer's journey in Harlem and the ways in which his experience in Harlem truly shaped his perspective on, especially one of the last things he wrote, The View from Below. And this was an interesting quote. This was one of the last things he wrote while imprisoned in Nazi Germany. He said, "There remains an inexperience of incomparable value. We have for once learned to see the great events of world history from below, from the perspective of the outcasts, the suspects, the maltreated, the powerless, the oppressed, the reviled. In short, from the perspective of those who suffer. We have to learn that personal suffering is a more effective key, a more rewarding principle for exploring the world in thought and action." And so I kind of put this up here as a guiding principle, kind of a guiding thing that kind of is the consistent theme of these three individuals that we spoke on during Holy Week was their willingness to adopt this view from below as a guiding light for their theological practice, and what that meant in terms of transforming their lives into lives of radical commitment, of living and working among the poor. And so prior to coming to seminary, it was questions like this that racked my mind. What is it that leads to this life of radical commitment? What do individuals who are on the path to lead certain lives that, in terms of Stringfellow and Russell specifically, that kind of characterize the American dream in a certain way? What do they see that forces them, that allows them to move into the poorest neighborhood in New York and live and work among the people there? So that's kind of the mystery, the question of faith that brought me to Union, guided by people like Bonhoeffer. So the first lecture we gave was on Romero. It was at St. Cecilia's Church, Roman Catholic Church on 106th Street. And we narrated the speaker who came in worked for a nonprofit organization. His name was Michael. He worked for a nonprofit organization in Buffalo, New York. And he came and presented on the life of Romero. And he outlined the ways in which Romero decided to enter seminary, began his ministry in the community of Anamoros before being assigned to San Miguel, where he served for 20 years. And the question he raised, which was interesting, was he began his lectures as to what caused Romero's transformation. And he outlined kind of a very broad narrative to say Archbishop Romero was appointed Archbishop of San Salvador because of the government supported it. He had a conservative reputation, and many of the priests in Latin America at the time were disappointed by his appointment, because at that point the liberation theology was something that was beginning to take root in Latin America, partially by the publication of this book. Gustavo Gutierrez, a Brazilian theologian who wrote A Theology of Liberation, which made the claim in this book that God has a preferential option for the poor, which is a very kind of, which turned things upside down in South America at the time, and really upset a lot of the Catholic establishment. And so the government elected Romero because they expected him to be silent, despite the violence that was all around him. Yet, when the violence came home, when his close friend, Father Rutillo, was murdered for standing up for what he believed in and fighting alongside the poor of El Salvador, it sparked a transformation in the life of Romero. And so he said, when I looked at Rutillo dying there dead, I thought, if they have killed him for doing what he did, then I too have to walk the same path. And so after that moment, the question I have is, what did he see? He saw something that led him to become one of the most vocal leaders in South America, standing up against poverty, violence, and injustice. And so we see a shift in Romero's thinking to saying things like, if we look at poverty from the outside, as if we're looking at a fire, that's not optimal for the poor. No matter how concerned we may be, we should get inside as if our mothers and sisters is burning. And he says, indeed, it's Christ who is there, hungry and suffering. And he said provocative things like a church that doesn't provoke any crises, a gospel that doesn't unsettle, a word of God that doesn't get under anyone's skin, a word of God that doesn't touch the real sins of society, in which is being proclaimed. What gospel is that? Letty Russell, the second person we spoke, the president of Union Seminary, came and gave a lecture on her because she knew her very well. Letty Russell was one of the first, as I said, one of the first women ordained in the Presbyterian Church. She was one of the first people to receive a theological degree from Harvard University. She got her doctorate at Union Seminary. But after graduating, she joined the East Harlem Protestant Parish, which was founded in 1948 by two Union Seminary grads. And these two young pastors sought to create a ministry in East Harlem built with and for the people of East Harlem. And so it was a series of churches that were established in East Harlem, set to serve those who lived there. And so Russell began her work in East Harlem, with the East Harlem Protestant Parish in 1952, right after she graduated. And she was the director of religious education at the Church of Ascension. She worked for 16 years there, 10 of which she spent as pastor of the Church of the Ascension. And Letty Russell's practice was one, she was transformed in East Harlem by her experience living with people who suffered daily. And she wrote a book right after her time there, which is hard to track down, and I've been trying to do it, but I can't. But she said things like, our struggle is to overcome the fear of difference and to break the bars that keep us apart. She says, whatever else the truth preaching of the word would need to include, it at least would have to be a word that speaks from the perspective of those who have been crushed and marginalized in our society. It would need to be a word of solidarity, healing and love in situations of brokenness and despair, and a disturbing and troubling word of justice to those who wish to protect their privilege by exclusion. The last day was on William Stringfellow, and former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, and the head of Sojourners, Jim Wallace, came. And they spoke about the influence of Stringfellow on their own lives. Wallace gave a really good, nice personal account of his. He was actually in charge of Stringfellow's estate when Stringfellow died. So he was able to give a kind of a crazy personal account of his involvement with Stringfellow. Stringfellow graduated from Harvard Law School. He spent a year, he went to Bates College. He spent a year at the London School of Economics, and then he moved to Harvard Law School, after which he moved into East Harlem to open up a free law practice for those who lived there. He wasn't a clergyman. He was Episcopalian, he wasn't ordained, but he was deeply theological. And so he said, these are three quotes that speak to me about kind of the radical vision that emerged out of his experience in East Harlem. He says, what is requisite to mission, to the exposure of God's word within the precarious and perishing existence of poverty, is the congregation which relies on and celebrates the resurrection. The task is to treat the nation within the tradition of biblical politics, to understand America biblically, not the other way around, not to put it in an appropriately awkward way, construe the Bible Americanly. It goes without saying, he says, that in my view, that in circumstances where moral decadence in the sense meant here, and the sense he meant here is kind of the power of death in the world, becomes so pervasive in a nation, one can discern and identify maturity, conscious, and paradoxically, freedom in human beings only among those who are in conflict with the established order, those who are opponents of the status quo, those in rebellion against the system, those who are prisoners, resistors, fugitives, and victims. And so my question kind of after these lectures was, these are three individuals who bridged two worlds. They bridged the world of privilege, they bridged of power, and they bridged the world of oppression. Stringfellow grew up poor. He was a gay man living in the 60s. Yet, and they had a choice to make. Letty Russell was the first, as I said, first woman ordained, one of the first women ordained by the Presbyterian Church. She reached her doctorate. She had a path laid out for her to be a famous academic. And Romero, groomed for a top position within the Catholic Church, chose to stand on the side of the poor. And so the question I have is for these individuals who bridge both worlds, what was it that they saw? What was their vision that allowed them to make this transition to a life of radical commitment? And so part of my time in East Harlem has been to raise questions. That's the mystery I'm left with. And that's the mystery I keep wishing to explore.